For a quarter of a century, Russia was ruled by a man remembered as one of the most brutal dictators in history, a figure so monolithic in his power and influence over the country, he governed that to even speak out against him and his policies could cause a person to vanish from their home or place of work. Some even disappeared from photos, where they once stood right next to the man himself. This one man, who alongside the Allied forces was instrumental in the defeat of Nazi Germany and bringing an end to World War II, arguably wielded and exercised more political power than any single figure in world history. And his name was Ioseb Dzhugashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a skilled but ruthless political leader. It was under his rule that Russia underwent massive and rapid industrialization to economically catch up with its capitalist rivals. Agriculture became a collective effort, often known as collective or communal farming. And it was one of the first steps that Stalin took to turn Russia into the global superpower known as the Soviet Union. Between the early 1930s and his eventual death in 1953, Joseph Stalin was responsible for the executions of well over 1 million of his own citizens. Many more were forced into intensive labor, deported from Russia, died as a result of starvation and famine, or were detained and interrogated by his secret police. In fact, it was perhaps his use of intense police terror that caused Stalin to go down in history. Stalin's methodology was known to be unforgiving and often cruel. However, it created for the Soviet Union a mighty military-industrial complex, as well as leading them directly into the nuclear age. But of course, those are the broad strokes. The larger impacts of Stalin's tyrannical rule over the Soviet Union. What was Stalin like as a person? What did the average day look like for a man who commanded the industry of an entire country and had a secret police force at his beck and call to silence anyone who spoke out against him? Was he an early morning rise and grind type of dictator? Or did the suffering and deaths he caused prevent old Stalin from getting out of bed before midday? Did he like animals? Well, we know there was a certain farm he probably wasn't too keen on. Let's peek behind the propaganda poster and look at a day in the life of Joseph Stalin. Just like the rest of us, Stalin's day would begin when he woke up. And by the admission of a lot of his staff, the man was a very late riser. After all, who doesn't love spending an extra few hours in bed? He would start accepting visitors to his office at any time between the middle of the day and 8 o'clock in the evening, with some of the meetings starting later going on to the early hours of the following morning. No wonder the guy needed his sleep. However, this was thought to be a rare exception rather than the norm for Stalin. Usually his meetings ran for around 3 or 4.5 hours. However, visitors to Stalin's office would often overlap in a quite peculiar fashion. During some meetings, if Stalin decided that another person's presence was needed, then that individual would have been summoned and immediately required to report to Stalin's office. And unlike missing a meeting with your boss, failing to show up would have far more drastic consequences. What still needs to be clarified is exactly how much work Stalin did before or between receiving visitors. Some historians claim he spent much of his time reading newspapers, although that shouldn't have taken up all that much of his day, unless he was a very, very slow reader. Newspapers and the press in the Soviet Union were controlled entirely by the state, as was all media produced within Russia at the time. Stalin had seen to it that the state maintained ownership over all productions and publications, including television and radio broadcasting, as well as newspaper, magazine, and book publishing. This is how he was able to disseminate propaganda to the masses so quickly. Needless to say, Stalin wouldn't have read anything in the paper that he didn't want anyone else to know. Some other testimonies from former staff say that he'd otherwise be reading through pages of reports and proposals, or sometimes just doing nothing at all before and in between his meetings. Someone should have gotten him a desk toy. During the Second World War, he was known to work as much as 15 hours a day, according to one of his field marshals. He certainly had no shortage of leading roles during the time, including the ranks of Supreme Commander, General Secretary of the Central Committee of All Union Communist Party, Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Soviet Union, Head of the State Defense Committee, and People's Commissar of Defense. Wow, those are some lengthy job titles. While Stalin and the Soviet Union's contributions to the war were partially responsible for pushing back against the Nazis in Europe, it seems he adopted a different working schedule after the war had concluded. A lot of the testimonies taken from people who worked directly with Stalin have to be taken with a grain or perhaps several large fistfuls of salt. The reason being that given Stalin's penchant for executing those he deemed to be speaking against him, we have to assume that all these testimonies are given in order to paint both him and, more importantly, the author of each testimony in the best possible light. In the Soviet Union, the truth was often best left unspoken for the sake of a person's safety or that of their family, who could also be at risk of serious consequences if a person were to speak in a way that offended the Soviet premier. Anyone who was too honest usually didn't live long enough to rise through the ranks to the point where they could comment on what Stalin got up to. That being said, despite his more basic rural upbringings in the small town of Gori, Georgia, one thing that Stalin was reported to love was a good concert. Live music, particularly classical or Soviet jazz, would preoccupy much of his free time. And well, by free time we mean he'd go to shows during the working day rather than in the evening after hours. He was also a fan of more conventional theatrical productions too, although he was more a fan of Soviet theater practitioner Konstantin Stanislavski than Russian theatrical producer Vsevolod Meyerhold, since the latter was arrested and tortured at Stalin's behest. This was during the Great Purge in 1937, wherein Stalin attempted to solidify his power over the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by conducting the removal or purging of people he felt threatened his rise to power. You see, Vladimir Lenin, the revolutionary founder of Soviet Russia who overthrew the Tsar during the Russian Revolution, died in 1924. Following his death, there was a power vacuum, with the question of who should assume authority over the country hanging in the air among Lenin's most trusted allies, one of whom was Joseph Stalin. To strengthen his grip on power, Stalin conducted the executions of people he felt would spread the influence of Leon Trotsky, another central figure in the October Revolution and one of Stalin's political rivals. One of the people killed during the Great Purge was Meyerhold, a theater director, actor, and producer at the time. He was accused of spying for the British and the Japanese, and after his arrest in 1939, was shot the following year. His wife, Russian actress Zenaida Reich, was also murdered in her home. Getting back to Stalin's day-to-day, with only a few hours of work under his belt and a musical performance or a dramatic show to follow, it would probably be the perfect time for some dinner. Never mind that many in the Soviet Union were starving, not Stalin and his closest advisors, aides, and of course his secret police. We may have been facetious a moment ago, but the number of ordinary people who were left desperate and deprived of their livelihoods by Stalin and his regime cannot be understated. Many across the Soviet Union went hungry. Some were forced to eat grass, tree bark, rats, and even their own dogs in order to stay alive. According to historians, in rare cases, some had to go even further to survive, thanks to the lack of food, by killing and eating their own family members. One particular example of this was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged the Soviet-controlled Republic of Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. It was a part of a larger famine that encompassed the Soviet Union, leading to mass-scale starvation among ordinary citizens, particularly in the regions where grain was grown within Russia and Kazakhstan. What made the famine in Ukraine particularly devastating, however, was that it was worsened by a series of political decisions made by Stalin himself, specifically to target the country and the people of Ukraine. After Stalin collectivized the Soviet Union's agriculture in 1929, teams of agitators forced peasants to give up their land and properties for the Communist Party so that collective farms could be created. Anyone who resisted the wide-scale collectivization was deported against their will. The collectivization caused a severe drop in the production of foodstuffs, which led to widespread shortages. In some parts of Ukraine, this sparked an armed uprising of peasants rebelling against Stalin's regime. As a result, Stalin was worried that this anger and resistance to his agricultural policies would cause him and the Soviet Union to lose control of Ukraine. So, did he offer them more food as recompense or allow peasants to re-establish their farms to increase production? No. He put a number of Ukrainian farms, villages, and even entire towns on a blacklist that prevented them from receiving what little food was available. The famine worsened as peasants were forbidden from leaving Ukraine to search for other food sources, and as a result, many people starved. Stalin, though, never went hungry. After a not-so-long day in the office, he would be accompanied by his closest allies and anyone else he felt like bringing along, usually by force, to a dinner that would last for as long as 4 entire hours. This was a lavish affair, with the guests being served luxury food complemented with expensive wine and hard liquor. When deciding who to invite to his dining table, the most important decision for Stalin would appear to be this: whose time was it to die? This applied especially to the top nomenklatura, the people appointed by the Communist Party to key administrative positions and posts within the government. It has been well established by historians and in-person testimony that Stalin rarely drank, if at all, and would only choose Georgian wines since those were from his homeland. Meanwhile, he'd allow his closest officials to get as drunk as possible, to the point that they totally lost their senses. He did this expecting that the more they drank, the more likely those who would dare speak against him would slip up. It was almost the original version of a lie detector, and in fact, it's a practice that's been in use since the days of the Roman Empire, where emperors would do the same: gather their supposed allies for dinner, get them drunk, and then see who starts spilling what they really think. And of course, anyone hiding criticism of Stalin would likely not live to experience what would have been an excruciating hangover. While it's not entirely clear, it is possible that these dinners weren't just subterfuge and weeding out detractors by getting them drunk. Some work might have also been conducted by Stalin during dinner time, with some testimonies claiming he'd occasionally receive phone calls requesting specific information during the dinner. Stalin and his top bureaucrats would often stay in the office until the early hours of the following day, normally until sunrise, keeping necessary staff with them. Many KGB teams would be required to stay on duty overnight too, just in case Stalin reached a decision about whose turn it was to disappear under the pretense of treachery. Much of this is speculation, of course. A lot of the recorded information from Soviet Russia at the time was tainted by the secrecy that Stalin liked to maintain. That, and the self-preservation of many government officials who worked directly with him, wanting to keep him happy and thus spare their own lives and their families' lives too. But then again, maybe there are some things that Stalin might have gotten up to during the day that he might not have wanted anyone at all to know about. What if, after all the other parts of his not-that-busy schedule were checked off, maybe whenever Stalin had a little extra time left before winding down, he'd occasionally round out the day with a visit to his Planet of the Apes-style human and ape hybrid creatures. Listen, believe us, we know how this sounds, but before you break the tinfoil hats out, we promise you, as much as we sound like we're making things up right now, we swear to you that this is 100% not a joke. In the mid-1920s, Stalin sought to rebuild the Red Army, the voluntary armed force of peasants and workers who had formed as a part of the Bolshevik Party following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So, what was Stalin's solution to rebuild the Red Army? Was it to recruit new soldiers from the working people of the Soviet Union? Maybe offer greater benefits to volunteer fighters and their families to incentivize conscripting? No, it was far, far stranger. During the Second World War, Stalin funded a project to create super warriors, or superhumans, and ordered Russia's top animal breeding expert, Ilya Ivanov, to produce a new species of troop that would be stronger than the average human being. The Soviet premier dreamed of creating a new, invincible type of human being, one that was impervious to pain and didn't care about the quality of the food they ate, able to fully function and maintain peak physical condition on simple army rations. His goal was to scientifically breed a race of beings that were half human, half ape. Again, we are not kidding here. As you might already be aware, human beings share a close biological relation to certain primates. We share around 95% of our DNA sequence with chimpanzees. They're one of our closest surviving evolutionary counterparts. And for centuries, there's been speculation that hybridization between our two species is possible, given the similarities in our DNA. So this is what Stalin set out to create. His intention was for these hybrids to retain their tremendous levels of physical strength of chimps, as well as their loyalty. He hoped that this would be combined with the human ability to follow directions and perform complex tasks. So, at his command, experiments went underway to try to achieve this bizarre goal. As you can probably imagine, Stalin didn't really lose much sleep over the potential ethical and moral dilemmas posed by these inhumane experiments. Stalin dispatched Ivanov to West Africa after the scientist had garnered himself quite a reputation. Under the Tsar, Ilya Ivanov established the world's first center for artificially inseminating horses in 1901. A similar center for experiments was founded in Stalin's birthplace of Georgia for ape hybrids to be raised. However, Ivanov's experiments were a total failure. Every attempt to inseminate human volunteers with monkey DNA was unsuccessful. As a direct result, Ilya Ivanov found himself not only disgraced, but the subject of political criticism during the Great Purge. Stalin had the scientist sentenced to 5 years exile in Kazakhstan. However, Ivanov would die only a year after his exile in 1932 after falling sick while standing on a freezing cold railway platform. It seems like Mr. Stalin didn't really deal with failure and rejection well. Now watch Most Evil Man, Joseph Stalin, or check out Real Reason Why the Soviet Union Collapsed.